Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your welcome. And I'd first like to start by thanking the Jimmy Reid Foundation for this invitation. It is a source of pride to join the previous speakers and also to speak at a foundation dedicated to a hero of mine. I also would like to thank the construction company outside working on George Square for removing Arthur Balfour's statue. When I thought of Jimmy Reid on the day I gave my rectoral speech, I thought also of Arthur Balfour, and I thought how unpleasant it must be that a working class boy from Glasgow and then a Palestinian refugee would come and take your job in an institution that you had built through the exploitation and the colonial plunder of others. I'd also like to thank Jimmy Reid. After coming out of Gaza, I was privileged to meet Alex Salmond, who told me that when he was First Minister of Scotland, the 5 presidents, chancellors of the Scottish universities had written to him asking for a change in the law that allowed rectors to be elected in Scotland, and that he had gone and spoke to Jimmy. And Jimmy was adamant that this is a democratic right by which students in Scotland were unique globally in being able to choose their rector. So today I would like to try, as we are approaching the 3rd year of the genocide, to understand what we've learned from this genocide. The formative components of settler colonialism and the way colonialism is a formative part in the development of European political identity. As the princelets of Spain were unified, Europe began its colonial endeavor, and with it, its genocidal turn. And so European political identity is structurally attached to settler colonialism, and with it, its genocidal instinct. And we saw over the last 2 years that despite the advancements in artificial intelligence with Lavender, the AI software that allowed Israelis to pick out their victims in Gaza, or another program called Where is Daddy that allowed them to choose 1,600 health workers for assassination, or access to Microsoft's AI. Despite the 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs, despite the electronic surveillance planes that the RAF flies over Gaza to provide real-life intelligence for the Israeli army, colonialism remains a very primitive enterprise that is essentially rooted in violence. And it's composed of genocidal erasure. An erasure is not just the taking of lives. It is the taking of lives and the denial of the existence and the humanity of the victims. It is the removal of their history, of their present, and to ensure that their future does not come along. But we also discovered that genocidal denial is a critical component of the genocidal project. Ghosting the victims, censoring those witnesses of the genocide, or pressuring them into censoring themselves is a critical component of this genocide and other genocides. And that the genocide, still, despite all of this technology, needed its primitive components. Geographic clearance that was started in Scotland at the embryonic phase of English colonialism. The use of famine, tested in Ireland with great success, and then West Bengal. The fostering of public health conditions that generate epidemics, that multiply the lives taken through a genocidal project. And racism, that racializing hierarchy that places the victims of genocide at a much lower rung in order to justify their killing and to render them ungrievable, to render their children ungrievable. One of the harshest and most difficult things for us living in the United Kingdom to accept is that had Israel killed 20,000 kittens, the liberal outrage from Blue Peter to the FA would have been deafening. But at the very beginning of the genocide, the Israeli head of the army dog-whistled racism by calling Palestinians human animals and triggered the racializing of Palestinians. And so in order for you to speak about the suffering of the Palestinians, there was a gate that you had to go into, and that gate was for you to accept that the lives of a handful of Israeli hostages were more important than the lives of millions of Palestinians. And so at each interview in the media, that gateway, that gatekeeper, whether it's the BBC or CNN or Sky, would insist that you accepted where the rungs occupied by the Israelis were and where the rungs occupied by the Palestinians were, in order for you to voice your victimhood. And another part of this genocide is what we had termed in the past scorched earth policy. But we had seen scorched earth policy in the 40s, 50s, and 60s as involving the burning, the destruction of great parts of the countryside. But what we have witnessed now in the 21st century, where the majority of the inhabitants of the global south live in urban areas, in refugee camps, in slums, that scorched earth means the destruction of water and sewage treatment plants. Scorched earth means the dismantlement of the health system, the killing of its professionals. These are the components of scorched earth in a world where the majority of the inhabitants live in urban dwellings. And in the last couple of days, we were given the last component of genocide, also primitive. Trump's plan for Gaza is, if you take out the Palestinians and you replace them with Native Americans, is the plan for a Native American reservation with its own casinos and with its own hotels to generate an income for a population deemed so low on the racializing rung that their needs are purely biological. They need to be fed, fed, they need to be watered, and they need somewhere to sleep. And now, in addition to that, we see the return of Viscount Blair, showing how, for a political career, the blood of 1 million Iraqis is a gift that keeps on giving. And the return of the High Commissioner in Palestine, almost 80 years after his predecessor, Sir Herbert Samuel, left the job in 1948, highlights that despite the technology, it is a very primitive and basic enterprise that hasn't really changed. So, standing where we are, as Palestinians, as people of color, as people from the global south, we wonder what is the nature of the relationship between Israel and Western imperialism. Israel is not an ally of Western imperialism. It's not Taiwan, it's not Ukraine. It's not even a client state like Saudi Arabia or one of the Latin American banana republics. Israel is something much more. This genocide has acted as a stressor that has lit the power grid that links imperialism across the globe with its central empire, the United States. And we have discovered the way in which Israel has been woven into the very fabric of power and power institutions in the West. And to give you a couple of examples, very basic examples. So The Guardian ran a story on the 17th of July about a British company called MBDA Limited. And MBDA Limited manufactures the wings of a bomb called GBU-39. And The Guardian was able to identify 34 attacks, one of which became famous for the silhouette of a 5-year-old girl who was trying to escape the fire. This 5-year-old Haneen Jarjawi lost both parents and her siblings in one of these attacks, whose bomb has wings made by MBDA. But MBDA has a £3 million research grant with Glasgow University. And the 350 million that it made in the last 2 years go back to its parent company, BAE Systems. And Glasgow University is one of the shareholders of BAE Systems. And so the blood of Hanan's parents and siblings, her burnt flesh, materialized into value extraction all the way at Glasgow University. And the same applies to the laser lab at Edinburgh University that plays a crucial part in the research on laser-guided bombs, along with Tel Aviv University, and so on and so forth. Whether it's the universities or the medical institutions like the Royal Colleges, who refuse to condemn the killing of some of its recipients, we discover that what has happened over the last few years, this trick, this mirage that liberalism uses of historicization, where in the last few years, these universities were claiming to want to decolonize everything from the curriculum to the soft furnishings, actually was just that, an age-old liberal trick of historicization and musification. And that these institutions that were built on slavery money and colonial theft, that perpetuated racializing theories about colonial endeavors, that rooted colonial endeavors in the inferiority of people of color had not really evolved and were as primitive as colonialism itself. So the next question that we need to ask is, whose genocide is this? Is this Netanyahu's genocide? Is this Israel's genocide? Well, of the $26 billion that the war had cost the Israeli economy, between the 7th of October 23 and the 7th of October 24, the United States had paid $17.9 billion. The rest, well, 30% of the rest came from Germany, that had increased its arms supplies to Israel tenfold following the 7th of October, and the United Kingdom, and France and Italy. 60% of the electronic surveillance is being done by the Royal Air Force over Gaza. Italian Air Force planes refuel Israeli planes on their way to bomb Yemen. But also, we discovered in the Arab world that Sykes-Picot, that plan to divide the Arab world and to create these modern states, had Israel at the center of the Arab regimes that were created as a result of this plan. And that, unlike what these Arab regimes were being told, their job was to protect Israel and not the other way around. They have contributed either directly, as in the case with many of the Gulf countries, or by allowing aid to Israel, as in the case of Palestine's neighbors. The other thing that we've learned is this performative brutalism that we've witnessed in the genocide, and the way it has become a vehicle for the normalization of an anti-humanist racializing language. We have been subjected to a process in which we have watched people of color being killed in a performative way. Premature babies at Rantisi Children's Hospital being left to die so that the ICRC staff find them. Shifa Hospital, Gaza's largest hospital, intentionally turned into a mass grave by executing 400 of its patients and staff, and then buried in very shallow graves in the courtyard of the hospital. And the reason for this performative violence is that it was necessary as a vehicle for the return of fascism from the margins of politics to the center of politics. Dehumanization, an anti-humanist approach to others, allowed fascism to make its way back from the margins of unacceptability to the Nigel Farages and the Trumps of today. Western liberal institutions committing genocide could not claim to be able to fight the discourse of fascism while practicing in a performative way the same anti-humanist, racializing, brutal violence against people of color. But in order for this to happen, something very important had to happen in the last 5 to 10 years. We have watched the Netanyahu government and the Israeli right wing create an alliance with anti-Semitic forces, fascistic parties in Europe, and reach a historic agreement with them that a change to the definition of anti-Semitism from a definition that links it to the hatred of Jews and Jewish communities and links it directly to the 20th century's worst atrocity is changed to that purely of anti-Israeli opposition. And so by the end, when Trump was elected in his inaugural festivities, the Anti-Defamation League, the most rabid Zionist American organization, described Elon Musk's Sieg Heil shoulder salute as an awkward shoulder movement, sending the message that we are, the 20th century definition of anti-Semitism is behind us, and a new form of anti-Semitism that allows Israel's new partners is now the accepted definition. I think Jimmy Reid was an extremely far-sighted reader of capitalism. In a lot of ways, akin not to Marx, but to Engels, because he saw it play itself out. And one of the most important observations he made was about expendable human beings. These expendable human beings have now become surplus populations in the eyes of global capital. Surplus to the needs of the market, surplus to the need to keep them healthy and to keep them alive. And Gaza has become a template for the removal of surplus political populations. A laboratory where not just the language and the philosophy and the logic and the technological advancement for getting rid of these surplus populations is developed. And the weapons and the language and the logic of Gaza will be seen in Kashmir and in Brazil. Wherever global capital deems populations as surplus to its needs, they will be eliminated in the same way. And therefore, it's not surprising that Starmer, in the midst of his support for the genocidal erasure of politically surplus Palestinians, brings in the most draconian measures to shorten the lives of disabled women and men in the United Kingdom through an act that denies them access to health care and social welfare. This social murder is a mechanism by which we reduce the life expectancy of surplus populations in the global north. And Glasgow has always been and remains an example by which social murder is used through the reduction of life expectancy for those populations that are deemed surplus. So I came to the United Kingdom in '88 and came straight to Scotland and to Glasgow, where my formative experience in political awareness was. And having been a citizen of this country, raising my children here, Starmer's description of real Britain has been as shocking to me as it is insidious. For Starmer, real Britain is painting a fence, running the raffle and cutting the halftime orange. But for me, the real Britain that I have seen is my friends Victoria Rose and Nick Maynard leaving a very successful and comfortable life as leading surgeons in the National Health Service to go to Gaza repeatedly and put their lives on the line and put their careers on the line back in the United Kingdom from organizations like UK Lawyers for Israel, because it is the right thing to do. Real Britain for me is union organizers who give up their time and their effort to fight for the rights of others, for fair deal and fair wage. Real Britain for me is families taking their children to the demo so that they teach them the importance of solidarity and seeing the humanity in those that you will most likely never meet, but are taught to hate as a way of justifying their killing. And unfortunately, real Britain is 30% of Britain's children, 4.5 million, who live in poverty and food insecurity. It is the fact that half of the people in poverty are either disabled or live in a household where there is a disabled family member. It is families with a disabled child facing significantly higher rates of poverty. Real Britain is the fact that 40% of Glasgow University students miss a meal because they cannot afford the rent. The great Marxist historian and critical thinker, Rodney Waters, a Guyanese radical and a freedom fighter who was killed by the CIA in the early 80s, asked once a question: what happens when we stop dreaming? Gaza is what happens when we stop dreaming of an end to Western imperialism in our lands. Gaza is what happens when we stop dreaming of a world where people hold the same value and where counting those killed, where the body count in wars is about the number of people who have lost their lives, not about the bodies that count. Viscount Blair happens after the killing of 1 million Iraqis, and a litany of one morally bankrupt and intellectually mediocre prime minister after another. That is what happens to us when we stop dreaming that we are capable of a better world. So I will end what started as a rallying call and really, for me, epitomizes the life of Jimmy Reid, but is unfortunately now a stark choice facing humanity. Socialismo o muerte. Thank you very much.